Rome. The year is 855. The sun hangs low over the city, casting long amber light across the crumbling walls of the Colosseum. The streets between St. Peter's Basilica and the Lateran Palace are lined with people. Merchants, beggars, monks, soldiers, mothers holding children above the crowd to catch a glimpse. The air smells of dust, incense, and sweat. Bells ring somewhere in the distance, slow and heavy, marking the rhythm of the procession. A parade of clergy moves through the narrow lanes. At its center, seated on a white horse draped in silk, is the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the Vicar of Christ. Flanked by deacons in flowing robes, surrounded by chanting voices and the low hum of prayer, the figure at the heart of this spectacle is the most powerful religious authority in the Western world. Roman soldiers walk ahead to clear the path. Behind the Pope, a long train of cardinals and monks stretches back through the streets like a river of white and gold. And then, something goes wrong. Somewhere between the Colosseum and the Basilica of San Clemente, the Pope doubles over. The horse stumbles. Attendants rush forward. The chanting falters. The crowd pushes closer, confused. A woman screams. And in that narrow Roman street, in front of hundreds of witnesses, the Pope gives birth to a child. The procession collapses into chaos, screams, accusations, fury. According to some versions of the story, the Pope drags the Pope through the streets, tied to a horse by the ankles, and stones her to death. In other versions, she is quietly removed, deposed, and spends the rest of her life in penance. Her son, some say, eventually becomes the Bishop of Ostia. But in every version of the story, one fact remains the same. The Pope was a woman, and no one had known. This is the legend of Pope Joan. Most modern historians believe this story is fiction, a medieval myth, a tale invented centuries after it supposedly happened, with no contemporary evidence to support it. But here is what makes this legend different from every other medieval fantasy. For roughly 300 years, almost no one in Europe doubted it was true. The story appeared in more than 500 historical texts. It was cited in papal chronicles, referenced in church trials, and used as a teaching example by Dominican monks. The Vatican's own librarian included it in an official biography of the popes, commissioned by the Pope himself. In Siena Cathedral, one of the most important churches in Italy, a sculpted bust of the female pope stood alongside every other pope for more than 3 centuries. Her inscription read, Johannes VIII, Fomina di Anglia, John VIII, a woman from England. And the tarot card known as the High Priestess, that mysterious robed woman sitting between 2 pillars, is widely believed to have originated from depictions of Pope Joan. Then, in 1601, Pope Clement VIII declared the legend officially untrue. The bust in Siena was removed. The name was erased from the records. The story was to be forgotten. But it wasn't. Not then, not now, not ever. What you're about to hear is not just the story of a woman who may or may not have been Pope. It's the story of what happens when an institution with absolute power decides that a piece of history needs to disappear, and why, after 900 years, the evidence keeps coming back. To understand how a woman could have become Pope, You first need to understand what the papacy actually looked like in the 9th century, because it looked nothing like what you might imagine. Forget the grand, untouchable institution you see today. In the 800s and 900s, the Catholic Church, and the papacy in particular, was drowning in blood, corruption, and chaos. Popes were murdered in their beds, poisoned at communion, and overthrown by the very families who had installed them. Some reigned for only weeks before being strangled or blinded and thrown into dungeons. The most infamous example came in the year 897. Pope Stephen VI had a problem with his predecessor, Pope Formosus. Formosus had made political decisions that Stephen despised, but Formosus was already dead, buried for nearly 9 months. That did not stop Stephen. He ordered the corpse dug up, dressed in full papal vestments, and propped on a throne in a Roman courtroom. The body had been decomposing underground for months. The stench was unbearable. A teenage deacon was assigned to stand behind the rotting corpse and answer questions on its behalf. The dead pope was found guilty of perjury and violating canon law. His blessing fingers were hacked off. His body was dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber River. This event is known as the Cadaver Synod, and it was not an anomaly. The fate of Stephen himself proved the point. Just months after the Cadaver Synod, a mob turned against him. He was stripped of his papal vestments, thrown into a prison cell, and strangled to death. The body of Formosus was fished out of the Tiber by a group of monks who claimed it had been done performing miracles. It was reburied with full honors, and then dug up again by a later pope, beheaded and thrown back into the river. The same corpse, desecrated, restored, and desecrated again. This was not an institution operating under divine order. This was an institution tearing itself apart. In the decades that followed, the papacy fell under the control of the Theophylacti family. The family's matriarch, Theodora, and her daughter, Marozia, wielded extraordinary power. Marozia was the mistress of Pope Sergius III and reportedly the mother of his son, who would later become Pope John XI. She personally orchestrated the imprisonment and murder of at least one pope. Historians gave this era a name, the Pornocracy, the rule of harlots, a period from roughly 904 to 963 in which the most powerful office in Christendom was passed from lover to son to puppet with no regard for doctrine or spiritual authority. This was the world Pope Joan supposedly lived in, a world where the papacy was not a sacred calling, but a political weapon. A world so chaotic that a careful, intelligent outsider might have found the cracks wide enough to slip through. And there's something else most people don't realize. Women disguising themselves as men in religious life was not unheard of. The early church venerated a category known as the transvestite saints, women who entered male monasteries in disguise and lived undetected for decades. Saint Euphrosyne of Alexandria fled an arranged marriage, shaved her head, entered a monastery under the name Smaragdus, and lived there for 38 years. Her own father visited the monastery regularly for spiritual guidance and never recognized her. Saint Marina entered a monastery as a boy named Marinus and endured years of false accusations in silence. Her true identity was only discovered when her body was prepared for burial. These were not obscure figures. They were celebrated across medieval Christendom as examples of extraordinary devotion. In the 9th century, the only reliable path to serious education for a woman was through a convent.
The Carolingian Renaissance had revived monastic learning, but the benefits reached nunneries more slowly than monasteries. For a woman with genuine intellectual ambition, the walls of a convent might not have been enough. And if she wanted access to the libraries, the debates, the philosophical circles that existed only in the male world, she had only one option. She would have had to become a man. So when we hear the story of Pope Joan, a brilliant woman who disguised herself, entered the church and rose through its ranks, it is tempting to dismiss it as fantasy. But every element of that story had a real-world precedent. Women did disguise themselves. Women did enter male religious communities. Women did go undetected for decades. The only thing truly unprecedented was the destination, not a monastery, not a bishopric, the throne of St. Peter itself.
The first known written account of a female pope comes from a Dominican friar named John de Miley, writing around 1250, roughly 400 years after the events supposedly took place. His version is brief and brutal. He does not name the woman. He places the events in 1099, not the 9th century. A woman disguised as a man rose through the church to become pope. One day, while mounting a horse, she gave birth. She was bound by the feet to a horse's tail, dragged through the streets, stoned by the crowd, and buried where she died. That is the earliest version. No backstory, no romance. Just a woman who climbed as high as anyone could climb in medieval Christendom and was destroyed the moment the truth emerged. But the version that conquered Europe came later. It was written by another Dominican, Martin of Opava, in his Chronicum Pontificum et Imperatorum in the late 13th century, and Martin gave the story everything it had been missing. According to Martin, the woman was born in Mainz, in what is now Germany. She was of English extraction, and her adopted name was Johannes Anglicus, John of England. As a young woman, she fell in love with a learned man and followed him to Athens, disguised in men's clothing. There, she threw herself into study, philosophy, theology, scripture, languages, with a ferocity that surpassed everyone around her. She had no equal, Martin wrote. It is worth pausing here to note what Martin is describing. This was not a woman who snuck into a minor clerical position and hid in the shadows. According to the Chronicle, she stood in front of the most educated men in Rome and outperformed them. She debated theology with cardinals. She interpreted scripture for bishops. And when the time came to choose a new pope, the men who had spent their careers studying the Word of God looked at this person and saw the most qualified candidate in the room. If the legend is true, Joan did not merely deceive the church, she convinced it on merit. When Pope Leo IV died in 855, the clergy and people of Rome chose her as her successor. She reigned for 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days. No one suspected, but she had continued her relationship with her lover and had become pregnant. Martin writes that she was ignorant of the exact time when the birth was expected, and so, during a papal procession along the Via Sacra, between the Colosseum and the Basilica of San Clemente, her labor began. She gave birth in the street, in full view of the faithful. The lane became known as the Shunned Street. From that day forward, all papal processions took a different route. And that detail is one of the most interesting in the entire legend because it is verifiably true.
From the 13th century onward, papal processions did avoid that specific street. The reason was never officially explained. And then there was the chair. The sedia stercoraria, the dung chair, a throne of red marble with a large keyhole-shaped opening in the seat. 2 of these chairs survive today, one in the Vatican museums, the other in the Louvre. According to the legend, after the scandal of Pope Joan, each newly elected pope was required to sit on this chair, disrobe from the waist down, and submit to a physical examination. A cardinal would reach through the opening to confirm the new pope's sex, then announce to the gathered clergy, "Duos habet e bene pendentes." He has 2, and they dangle nicely. Only then would the election be confirmed. Historians have offered many explanations: Roman birthing stools, imperial thrones repurposed for ceremony. The humanist Jacopo d'Angelo, who attended Pope Gregory XII's enthronement in 1406, noted that the Pope sat on 2 pierced chairs and remarked that the vulgar tell the insane fable that he is touched to verify that he is indeed a man. Even in the 15th century, educated observers called it a myth, but the chairs were real, the ritual seating happened, and the legend persisted. Because when you have a marble throne with a hole in it and a story that explains exactly why, the story tends to win. Here is the part that surprises most people. Pope Joan was not a fringe conspiracy. For more than 300 years, the existence of a female pope was treated as established historical fact by the Church itself. The Dominican order used the story as a moral teaching example in their sermons. They were not treating it as allegory. They were treating it as something that had actually happened. In Siena Cathedral, a series of sculpted busts depicted every pope in history, lining the upper nave in chronological order from St. Peter onward. There, between Leo IV and Benedict III, stood a bust inscribed Johannes VIII, Foemina de Anglia, John VIII, a woman from England. This was not hidden or tucked away in some corner. It stood in one of the most prominent cathedrals in the Papal States, the territory directly controlled by the Pope, in plain view of pilgrims, clergy, and visiting dignitaries for more than 300 years. In 1479, the Vatican librarian Bartolomeo Platina published a biography of every pope commissioned by Pope Sixtus IV himself. Platina included Pope Joan. He noted the story was vulgarly told by uncertain authors, but wrote that he would rather mistake with the rest of the world than appear obstinate by leaving it out. The legend was so accepted that even the Vatican's own librarian felt he could not ignore it. Boccaccio included her in 1353's De Mulieribus Claris, a collection of biographies of famous women. Petrarch referenced her in his Chronicle of Popes. These were the defining intellectuals of the Renaissance, and they treated Pope Joan as historical record. But the most remarkable moment came in 1415 at the Council of Constance, one of the most important church councils in medieval history. Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer, stood trial for heresy. He was fighting for his life. In his defense, he argued that the Church does not necessarily need a pope, because during the reign of Pope Agnes, his name for Joan, the Church managed perfectly well. The judges told Huss his argument was flawed, but not a single person in that courtroom disputed that Pope Joan had existed. Not the cardinals, not the bishops, not the theologians. in the highest ecclesiastical court in Europe, at a trial whose outcome would determine the future of a major reform movement, the existence of a female pope was treated as uncontested fact. Hus was burned at the stake later that year, but the story survived him. It survived because it had something most legends do not: institutional endorsement. Cathedral busts, Vatican-commissioned books, Dominican sermons, conciliar testimony. The machinery of the Church itself had absorbed the legend and treated it as truth. And that raises a question more interesting than whether Joan existed.
If she didn't, then why did the most powerful institution on earth believe it for so long? Why did the Vatican's own scholars include her in official histories? Why did a cathedral in the Papal States carve her face in stone? Either Joan was real, or the Church made a mistake so enormous that it lasted 300 years. Neither answer is comfortable. The legend of Pope Joan survived for centuries without serious challenge. Then the Reformation arrived, and everything changed. In the early 16th century, Protestant reformers tore through Catholic authority. They questioned papal infallibility, the sale of indulgences, the corruption of the clergy, and they found Pope Joan. The story was perfect ammunition. A woman had infiltrated the holiest office in Christendom, and the Church had been too blind to notice. Protestant writers seized on it. Alexander Cook published Pope Joan, a dialogue between a Protestant and a Papist, later republished under the title A Present for a Papist, or The Life and Death of Pope Joan, plainly proving that a woman called Joan was really Pope of Rome. The book included a detailed engraving of the moment of birth, a rather surprised-looking baby peeking out from under the papal robes. For the Catholic Church, this was no longer a harmless legend. It was a weapon, and weapons had to be neutralized. The counterattack began in 1587. Florimond de Raymond, a French magistrate, published Erreurs populaires de la Papesse Joan, a methodical deconstruction of the legend using humanist textual criticism. He examined every source, compared every timeline, and pulled the story apart detail by detail. The book went through 15 editions over the next century, a sign of both its influence and the ferocity of the debate. Then came the official response. In 1601, Pope Clement VIII declared the legend untrue, and the erasure began. In Siena Cathedral, the bust that had stood for 3 centuries was removed. The stone was recarved into the face of Pope Zachary. The inscription was changed. 300 years of presence undone with a chisel. The name vanished from official papal lists. Chronicles were revised. References were annotated with disclaimers or quietly deleted. The female pope was not just declared false, she was made to have never existed. The definitive blow came from an unlikely source, a Protestant. David Blondel, a French Huguenot historian, published 2 treatises in 1647 and 1657 that demolished the legend's plausibility. His argument was devastating in its simplicity. Pope Leo IV died on July 17, 855. Benedict III was consecrated on September 29th of the same year. Coins bearing Benedict's image alongside Emperor Lothar, who died September 28, 855, proved Benedict was recognized as pope before that date. On October 7, 855, Benedict issued a charter for the Abbey of Corvey.
Archbishop Hincmar of Reims recorded sending a messenger to Leo, who, learning of Leo's death mid-journey, delivered his petition to Benedict III instead. There was no gap, no 2-year vacancy, no room for a female pope between Leo and Benedict. The timeline was confirmed by coins, charters, and independent correspondence from multiple countries. Blondel also noted that 9th-century enemies of the papacy never mentioned a female pope. Photius of Constantinople, who had every reason to humiliate Rome, referred only to Leo and Benedict, successively great priests of the Roman Church. No Joan, no scandal, no hint of anything unusual. There was one more piece of evidence that skeptics pointed to. If a female pope had truly been exposed in the streets of Rome in the 9th century, it would have been one of the most shocking events in the history of Christendom. News of that magnitude would have traveled to every court in Europe, every monastery, every rival patriarchate. And yet there is complete silence. No letter, no chronicle entry, no marginal note in any surviving manuscript from the 9th or 10th centuries mentions such an event. The silence is not merely an absence of evidence, it is, critics argue, evidence of absence. Something that extraordinary could not have happened without leaving a trace. The case seemed closed. Pope Joan was a 13th century invention projected onto a 9th century timeline, perhaps born from satirical references to Pope John XI, who was dominated by his mother Marozia during the pornography, and gradually hardened into fact through centuries of repetition. For most historians, that is where the story ends, but not for everyone. In 2018, Michael Hobbicht, an archaeologist at Flinders University in Australia, reopened the question. Hobbicht and graphoanalyst Marguerite Speicher examined medieval coins bearing the papal monogram of Pope John VIII, who reigned from 872 to 882. What they found was unexpected. Coins from the earlier period, roughly 856 to 858, bore a structurally different monogram from those minted after 875. Different enough, Hobbicht argued, to belong to two separate popes. His conclusion? The earlier monogram belonged to Johannes Anglicus, Pope Joan. If correct, her brief reign would fall between Benedict III and Nicholas I. The academic response was cautious. Critics noted that medieval coin forgery was common and that popes named John have always caused numbering confusion. The research did not prove Joan existed, but it demonstrated that the question is not entirely settled. In the physical evidence of the medieval world, there are anomalies that resist easy explanation. And it raised a question that has followed this story for centuries. Did the Church disprove the legend of Pope Joan, or did it simply decide at a politically convenient moment that the legend needed to go away? There is a difference between refutation and erasure, and in the case of Pope Joan, the line between the two has never been entirely clear.
Pope Joan has been declared a myth by popes, debunked by Protestant scholars, and dismissed by virtually every serious historian of the modern era. And yet she will not go away. Around 1450, the Visconti Sforza family of Milan commissioned one of the earliest known tarot decks. Among its cards was an image that has puzzled scholars ever since. A robed woman wearing a papal tiara seated between two pillars holding an open book. The card became known as the High Priestess. Whether it was directly inspired by Pope Joan is debated, but the resemblance is hard to ignore. A woman in papal authority holding secret knowledge. Today, the High Priestess remains one of the most recognized symbols in tarot, pulled millions of times a year by people who have no idea they may be holding a reference to a 900-year-old scandal. The legend kept resurfacing in every century that followed. Donna Woolfolk Cross's 1996 novel, Pope Joan, became an international bestseller and was adapted into a 2009 film. Robert Harris's Conclave used the legend as hidden architecture for its climactic twist and was itself made into a 2024 film. More than 500 historical texts, novels, films, and academic papers have kept Joan alive across the centuries. As recently as 2018, new research was being published. The story refuses to stay buried.
For a person who never existed, she has had a remarkably productive career. And there is a reason for that. The story of Pope Joan endures because it strikes at something fundamental about how power works. Every institution that accumulates enough authority eventually faces the same question. What happens when someone who was never supposed to be inside the walls makes it all the way to the top? The answer, in Joan's case, was total erasure. Not punishment, erasure. The removal of the name, the face, the record, the memory. But erasure has a paradoxical effect. The harder you work to make something disappear, the more visible the absence becomes. A gap in a timeline, a street that processions avoid for no stated reason, a marble chair with a hole that no one can quite explain, a row of papal busts where one face has been recarved and one inscription changed. These silences speak, and people listen. Joan may be fiction, but the erasure was real. The busts were recarved, the lists were altered, the street was avoided. And that is what makes the story immortal. Not the woman herself, but the shape of the hole she left behind. If you ever find yourself in Rome, you can still walk the route. From the Colosseum south toward the Basilica of San Clemente. There is a narrow lane between them. No plaque, no marker, no sign that anything ever happened there. But for 900 years, every pope who processed through this city chose to take a different road. And no one has ever fully explained why.